Good evening and welcome. I'm Michael Usher and this is the latest from 7 News this Monday evening. New tonight, the Qantas quarantine flight lands in Australia. Next stop, Christmas Island. We cross to the remote airport holding the passengers. The latest numbers on the coronavirus. Cases soar in China, where there's now concern about a new outbreak of bird flu. Barnaby's back. He's thrown his Akubra in the ring to lead the Nationals once again. He has key support tonight. It's all going to be decided in the morning. An overwhelming vigil this evening for the children killed in that Sydney crash and an extraordinary act of forgiveness from their mother. Another scaffolding collapse. 5 Melbourne construction workers badly injured. The latest on their condition and the cause. Lost for a night, the driver trapped in thick bush after his car plunged down a Gold Coast embankment. And what's all the fuss? Only the most hyped sports event in the world, and this fan slept through it all. The story behind the Super Bowl snooze. It's our final frame. Tonight we begin with the developing global health crisis. The coronavirus outbreak has quickly spread around the globe. Let's take a look at the numbers right now. The death toll has now passed 360 people. Almost 20,000 have been infected around the world. And hundreds of Australians stranded at outbreak ground zero in China have been evacuated. Right now, those people are being held at a military base in Learmonth, Western Australia, waiting for a transfer to Christmas Island, where they'll remain for at least 2 weeks. Let's begin our coverage with reporter El Giorgio in Learmonth tonight. El, good evening to you. You have some breaking news for us there.
Good evening, Michael. We sure do. In the last 5 minutes, we saw a few dozen of these 243 people that touched down here at Learmonth Air Base from the epicentre of this coronavirus outbreak from the central Chinese city of Wuhan. They have just taken off on one of those small flights, and we now believe they are bound for Christmas Island. This would come as such a relief for many of the locals here in Exmouth today who were not expecting almost 250 potentially infected people to arrive in their town, although the health department did tell us that they had absolutely nothing to worry about, because all of those passengers were never going to leave the airbase and then interact with the general public. They were always going to be locked down for the entirety of their stay. There is still one plane on the tarmac now. It has been loaded up, so we are expecting that plane to leave quite soon as well.
So, just briefly before I go on to the next point, El, the logistics, that Qantas Jumbo couldn't go to Christmas Island, so they're now shuttling them to Christmas Island. Is that correct?
Exactly. That Qantas jumbo jet was just simply too big to make a safe landing for that 2.5-hour journey to Christmas Island here from WA's Pilbara region. That's why they had to bring in those 2 smaller aircrafts to do this job. So as I say, one has just taken off. That'll now probably touch down in Christmas Island to begin that quarantine process in about 2.5 hours' time. And now we're just waiting for that second one to go. We also believe that one of those planes will then turn around, come back to Learmonth and then take another plane load of passengers to Christmas Island.
Now, El, we're learning tonight other Australians are going to be quarantined in New Zealand. What is that story?
Yes, we have just gotten word just in the last few minutes that a group of Australians will be flown on an Air New Zealand flight into Auckland, which of course would take a little bit of pressure off that major evacuation situation that is happening here in Australia. But we do believe that it'll sort of run the same way as what we're seeing here out of Learmonth tonight. They will then be checked over by doctors in New Zealand to make sure they are healthy enough to fly before then heading to Christmas Island, where, as I say, they will go through that quarantine process.
All right, El Giorgio in Learmonth, WA, thank you for that tonight. The coronavirus has led to most airlines around the globe cancelling commercial flights in and out of China, and there are now concerns over a second viral outbreak on the mainland with the more aggressive bird flu detected at a poultry farm. Patrick Fock joins me now from Beijing. Patrick, good evening to you. Thanks again for joining the latest. What can you tell us about this second threat, this second concern?
Yeah, well, it's certainly compounding the existing problem with the coronavirus, and people are, as you can imagine, very nervous indeed. As far as we understand, thousands of chickens have already been culled, but although the bird flu is much more deadly than the coronavirus, it's actually a lot harder to transmit to humans and for it to pass on from human to human. So there is a concern there right now. How serious it is, we're not entirely sure. Of course, that's having an impact on the economy as well, but hard to say just how wide that impact's going to be in the long run.
Patrick, give us some insight into what's happening right now in that Wuhan province and its surrounds.
Well, the numbers don't make for pretty reading. We've got about 17,500 confirmed cases of infections and over 360 deaths. Now, what's been particularly worrying about that in the last 24 hours is the rate of transmission and the number of deaths just in the last 24 hours have been the highest daily rate. So there's no sign whatsoever that any of this is coming under control, despite all the containment efforts that are going on. There is one bit of news that is perhaps giving people a little bit of a boost here. The first of two hospitals that are being built specifically for coronavirus patients was complete yesterday, and it was handed over to military medics, and as far as we understand, it's begun accepting patients today. But the situation on the ground is still very serious indeed. In Wuhan, they are isolating anybody showing any symptoms and anybody that has come into contact with them as well. And in the neighbouring city of Huanggang, they've gone to the extent of telling people they've got to stay indoors altogether, and only one person, a designated family member, is allowed to go out to pick up supplies every couple of days. So the quarantining efforts here are really very serious indeed. And, obviously not a very happy situation for people to be living through at all.
At all, indeed. All right, Patrick Falk in Beijing, thank you. And 7 News Chief Reporter Chris Reason is on Christmas Island right now, where Australians rescued from Wuhan will be quarantined. Chris, what is the state of play there?
Well, Michael, good evening to you. And as one newspaper headlined it today, welcome to Virus Island. And aren't locals here upset about that? Michael, we're expecting the planes to arrive, the two of them to arrive in the next couple of hours, and we'll see similar scenes to what we saw at Learmont this afternoon. Essentially, those two planes will stop on the tarmac and the buses will approach them. The passengers will be slowly escorted off and carefully onto those buses, and then they'll be driven up towards the IDC, the Immigration Detention Centre. They won't go anywhere near the terminals. At the IDC, of course, we've got that team of OSMAT specialists, the medical assistance teams, who've been setting up over the weekend their deployable hospital, the centrepiece of that negative pressure room, the room complete a tent-like structure that's made to allow fresh air in but won't let contaminated air out. That's the centrepiece of their hospital facility they built on the sports grounds right in the middle of the IDC. Now, 7 News was lucky enough to get in contact with and be helped by two young Australian evacuees today, Rob Kellett and Josh Nielsen, who shared with us via their iPhones their journey as they went through the day, getting from the city of Wuhan out to the airport there, into the terminal to undergo their medical checks, going through everything that had to be done, including having medical wristbands put on before they were allowed onto the plane. And they sent us some video from inside the plane as well. As they took their seats, they sat down to be welcomed not by the usual toothbrush and amenities kit, but a bag marked clinical waste, and inside that there were face masks, hand wipes and sanitizer as well. They said that the mood on board the plane as they were taking off was a very sombre one. Now, we know that today, though, they are coming in on those two Skytracker charter jets. Those jets are three A319s. They can usually take about 150 passengers. Each one, though, is taking between 60 and 70, which suggests to me they're seating them every second row or every second seat for obvious reasons. Now, either way, we expect the first of those in a couple of hours, as I say. Those flights will then go back to Learmont, pick up the second wave, and that second wave should arrive sometime tomorrow morning. As I say, the end of a very, very long journey.
Chris Reason there on Christmas Island. Now, the homicide squad has joined the investigation into the death of a 3-year-old girl who was found in a hot car in Victoria's Gippsland region. She died late on Friday in the town of Morwell. Temperatures there were still 34 degrees at 8:30 that night. Detectives are looking at how she came to be in that car. This police video captures the dramatic pursuit and arrest of a killer hit-and-run driver. Mother of four, Sophie Bryan, was high on drugs and on her mobile, and driving a stolen car when she rammed and killed a young Indian delivery truck driver. Today, the 26-year-old broke down in court as she faced her victim's mother. She'll be sentenced in March. Tonight, confirmation, it's on. In just the last few hours, the chances of Barnaby Joyce pulling off a highly charged political comeback have grown. Let's bring in our political correspondent, Tim Lester, who's in Canberra. Tim, good evening to you. Well, with the National Party set to spill its leadership tomorrow morning, a key cabinet minister has quit his post to join the Joyce rebels. Let's take a listen.
This evening I've spoken to the Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack and I've offered my resignation as Minister for Resources in Northern Australia. I've done so because pending a leadership ballot in the Nationals Party tomorrow, I will back Barnaby Joyce for leader. We need a bulldog, we need a fighter to fight back against those. They want to take away people's coal jobs, they want to shut down cane farms, they want to stop even Indigenous Australians developing their own land.
All right, Tim, so there you go. What impact will that have on things playing out tomorrow?
Well, Michael, Matt Canavan is senior. He's one of only four Nationals in federal cabinet, or was one of only four. Barnaby Joyce likely sees his public resignation as a way to shoot some electricity into Barnaby's leadership bid, hopefully jolt some of the undecided in the 21-member National Party room into believing that Barnaby has the momentum and that they need to get on to a winner. Other Nationals, though, will know that Barnaby Joyce and Matt Canavan are long-time friends. This is not a surprising alliance in that sense. The numbers, well, one National tells me this is a total lottery. They simply don't know, many of them in the party room, let alone us outside, though before the Canavan intervention, the general feeling around here was that, if anything, Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack would likely just hold on. I can tell you also of one other late mover in this game, that is Queenslander Keith Pitt. He has confirmed to 7 News that he will contest the deputy leadership along with New South Wales MP David Gillespie and Queensland Minister David Littleproud. Littleproud is seen as the favourite for the deputy position. Michael?
Well, Tim, an interesting side note from Matt Canavan tonight. He's admitted to a conflict of interest as he steps down. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, an undeclared interest, Michael. Matt Canavan says he remembered just last week signing up a number of years ago as a supporter of the North Queensland Cowboys. Now, he did not declare that interest. He was also a minister last November when a government infrastructure facility under his guide announced an investment loan to the club. He says he has briefed Prime Minister Morrison on this now discovered conflict of interest. Of course, fellow National Bridget McKenzie has just quit, citing a conflict of interest to try to, we understand, protect other ministers who might have been involved in the sports rorts. Now, her precedent has actually bitten another minister. Michael?
All right, well, the Nationals will work all that in the morning, Tim. Two other parties, though, they're facing a change of leadership.
Tomorrow, the Greens will elect a leader to replace Richard Di Natale. 5 years in the job of Greens leader. He is leaving the Senate for family reasons. We understand Adam Bant is seen as one possible replacement. And Maverick independent Bob Katter has turned to his son, Robbie, to take over the role of leader of his self-named party. Never mind that Robbie isn't in federal parliament. He's a member in Queensland State Parliament. Michael?
Interesting moves in Canberra tonight. All right, Tim Lester, thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
There have been incredibly moving scenes in Sydney tonight as a huge crowd gathered to remember 4 children killed by an allegedly drunk driver on Saturday. Their heartbroken families, friends, members of the local Maronite Catholic Church joining together in prayer at the scene of the unimaginable tragedy.
We must now pray for their families. We must pray now for the 3 children that remain in the hospital. So with all your heart, don't let this tragedy take you away from your faith. Let this bring you closer as it has to your faith.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee.
And our reporter Alex Hart was at that service this evening. Alex, good evening to you. Still just unbelievable grief and too hard to comprehend. This tragedy really has touched so many, hasn't it?
Yes, it has, Michael. You only have to see behind me tonight to see these people who are still gathered here well into the evening to pay their respects. This is a local community that has been incredibly hard hit by this tragedy. A very tight-knit community held together by their faith. There must have been more than 1,000 people here earlier tonight for this service along Beddington Road where this accident happened on Saturday night. In fact, the road was closed off throughout this service, remembering those 4 young children who died, Anthony, Angelina and Sienna, and also their cousin Veronique. Scenes of so much sadness, so much despair, but also so much strength and support. The families of these young people, inconsolable at times as the community members wrap their hands around them, wrap their arms around them. Priests from the local Our Lady of Lebanon Cathedral, the biggest Maronite Catholic parish in Australia, led this service. They said the rosary and also moved through the Stations of the Cross, dedicating them to these young victims. It is just so difficult to comprehend and to get your head around. The mother of the 3 young siblings who were killed here, Layla Abdullah, was front and centre throughout this service, and she also spoke earlier today about her loss.
My kids are angels. They are right now with us. I can feel them. I've got goosebumps. I can feel them touching me and telling me that they are with us.
And Alex, also the parents of the driver, they've also spoken today. What did they have to say?
Yes, Michael, the alleged drunk driver in this, Samuel Davidson, his father, Alan, a retired police detective, and also his mother, Kay. They said that their son is deeply remorseful for what has happened, and despite what happened here on Saturday night, they say he does have a good heart. They also said they are very sorry for the poor families who have lost their children, and also revealed that they too had lost a daughter 10 years ago, and that they said they now feel like they have lost their son as well, given he will likely be behind bars for many, many years. Layla Abdullah also said earlier today that she cannot bring herself to hate Samuel Davidson. It is simply not in her faith to do so, and that she must forgive him, but that she also wants the courts to do what is fair and right. Davidson himself will next be back in court in April, and it is expected that the 4 young children who died here on Saturday night will be laid to rest by the end of the week. Michael.
Extraordinary. All right, Alex Hart, thank you. 5 construction workers are right now in hospital after scaffolding at their worksite collapsed. Let's bring in Georgia Comensoli, who's across this story for us this evening. Georgia, good evening to you. Does anyone know how this happened?
Yeah, good evening, Michael. Well, right now, WorkSafe and the CFMEU are trying to determine exactly that. This collapse happened earlier today. The scaffolding was only erected as a way to keep this property and this development safe. It's a row of townhouses in Melbourne's north, and at the time that this scaffolding fell, unfortunately, 5 tradesmen were on top of it. Now, just to show the enormity of this situation, those pictures really show how forceful this crash would have been. It ripped timber off the property, and at one point a ute was partially crushed by that falling timber. There were dozens of tradesmen on the worksite, and unfortunately 5 men were on top of it as it fell.
Let's have a listen to what one of their co-workers had to say, Georgia.
Them jumped into the building from the top. Another one held on. As it was falling off, he jumped straight off. So he was all right, but some of them were unfortunate to be in the middle, so they got stuck with all the metal and all the braces and everything on top of them. Screaming, some of them couldn't breathe properly, and some of them were yelling out, "Who knows CPR?"
Georgia, those men, we understand, are at 2 different hospitals. What are their conditions tonight?
Well, Michael, we don't know exactly what type of injuries they suffered, but 4 men were rushed here to the Alfred Hospital. The 5th man was taken to the Royal Melbourne Hospital. Luckily tonight, 4 of them are now in a stable condition, whilst that last 5th man is in a serious condition tonight. That worksite will remain closed off while WorkSafe try and determine exactly how this workplace accident happened. Michael?
All right, in Melbourne tonight, Georgia Comensoli, thank you. A man has spent a painful night trapped in thick bush after his car plunged 100 metres down a steep embankment on the Gold Coast hinterland. Joel Dry joins me with the latest on this. Joel, good evening to you. How's that man going?
Good evening, Michael. Well, thankfully, he is out of this weather. He is in the Princess Alexandra Hospital behind me, receiving treatment and safe. A far cry from his situation this time last night when he was very much alone and in pain at the bottom of a steep embankment in the Gold Coast hinterland. That man was in a four-wheel drive yesterday when something has caused it to lose control and veer off of that slope and down a distance of about 100 metres at Mount Tamborine. Emergency services crews that I spoke to today said the man simply wasn't able to call for help, and it was not until some tyre tracks were noticed at the top of the hill this afternoon that emergency services were eventually called. That began a very tricky and delicate rescue operation using specialist technicians who had to abseil down through some really dense scrub. They were joined by some critical care paramedics who got to that patient. They were able to stabilise him, give him some initial treatment. They then were going to try to winch him out, but the scrub was too dense. They had to carry him by hand down to a clearing where he was eventually airlifted, brought to hospital here. An amazing story and a very job well done by all these emergency services that were involved in this operation this afternoon.
Absolutely. Job well done to you and your crew too. Get out of the rain. Joel Dry in Brisbane. Thank you. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is tonight promising changes to the system that deals with those convicted of terrorism offences. It comes after police shot dead a terrorist who stabbed two people just a week after his release from prison. Let's bring in our Europe Bureau Chief Hugh Whitfield now. Hugh, good evening to you. Boris Johnson's just spoken. Let's first take a listen to that.
We do think it's time to take action to ensure that people, irrespective of the law that we're bringing in, people in the current stream do not qualify automatically for early release.
All right, Hugh, what exactly is the PM proposing here?
Well, Michael is proposing fundamental changes to the criminal justice system here when it relates to convicted terrorists and those locked up in jail. There is a system here in the UK where you serve half of your sentence and you are entitled to automatic early release. Now, that is the system that this terrorist was released under. It is the system that the terrorist at London Bridge was released under, and it has clearly failed at least twice. Boris Johnson, after the London Bridge attack in November last year, did promise that he would clean up the system. That hasn't happened seemingly yet, and it's taken this for him to basically promise to keep those terrorists locked up. He faces a couple of challenges. Primarily, can he legally change the system to affect those already in jail, or would it only affect those who are convicted in the future? And also what to do with these hundreds of terrorists who will be locked up in jail for many, many years to come if he successfully changes the system, with experts describing prisons in this country as essentially universities for extremists.
So what's the latest on the investigation into today, Hugh?
Well, the cordon remains in place here in Streatham on the high road. We've just seen police walk through here, still looking for evidence at the scene. We've also heard from the mother of the terrorist. She's described her son as, quote, a nice, polite boy. We've also seen raids on two addresses, including the hostel where the terrorist was living, not far from here in Streatham. No arrests at this stage. Keep in mind as well that police know very well this man, because they had been following him after his early release from prison just days ago. He'd been convicted of 13 terror offences, described as a knife fanatic who had possession of a bomb-making manual before being locked up. So a lot of challenges for the judicial system in this country, and certainly now more focus on those other terrorists who've been released under this system of early release. Around 800 extremists being monitored by police and intelligence services right now across the UK, and that stretches from Islamist terrorists right through to right-wing extremists as well, Michael.
Hugh Whitfield on the streets of London. Thank you for that tonight. Still to come, our borders are closed to China, but just how strong are they against the threat of the coronavirus? A global health security expert joins me. Meanwhile, our economy's taking a major hit. Gemma Acton explains the impacts of that outbreak. Koalas under threat not from fires. The woman who lifted the lid on a wildlife tragedy speaks out. And how Margot Robbie and Brad Pitt stole the show at the BAFTAs in London. Hear their dig at Harry and Meghan next. It's all coming up on the latest from 7 News. Back in a minute. Well, tonight, 243 evacuees from Wuhan are en route to Christmas Island, where they'll be quarantined for at least 2 weeks over coronavirus fears. For more on this, I'm joined by global health security expert Adam Kamrad-Scott in Canberra. Adam, thanks for joining the latest this evening. Let me ask you first, is this the first time Australia's used Christmas Island as a quarantine zone?
To our knowledge, it is actually. So we've seen the Australian government going back to 1918 use the quarantine station in Sydney Harbour for pandemic flu, but we've not seen the use of Christmas Island in this way previously.
It's an interesting move. Look, the government's also announced that foreign travellers who've either left or passed through China will be denied entry to Australia. I just wonder, how difficult is that going to be to police, do you think?
It can be quite difficult, principally because people become very inventive in trying to circumvent these types of border control measures. There's good examples of people switching passports and also using transfers to alternative countries to try and get around these sorts of travel restrictions. So they can work for a percentage of the population and arguably the bulk, but it doesn't stop viruses circulating in this sort of environment.
Just on that point briefly, are we the only country going to these extremes, or are we falling in line with other international destinations as well?
No, there's a number of countries that have implemented these sorts of measures, but importantly, these are measures that the World Health Organization has strongly advised against, and there is an international framework called the International Health Regulations, which actually sort of maintains that these types of measures should not be implemented in these circumstances.
How is Australia placed to deal with any new cases of coronavirus, Adam?
Australia is really well placed to deal with these types of events, principally because we have an advanced healthcare system, which is the envy of many countries in the world, but we also regularly exercise for these types of eventualities, and Australia is actually far ahead in terms of pandemic preparedness than many countries in the world. So we're in a good position.
Just with your experience, I think it would help our viewers to understand this, and I would appreciate it. Give me, on a scale of diseases, where coronavirus actually sits as a threat to us if it really spread in Australia?
That's a good question, and it's a bit of a challenge to compare diseases like this, only because they're all a little bit different. But if we were to compare sort of just the infectious nature of it, so how infectious it is, by comparison, if we look at measles, that on average has a potential to infect around 11 to 18 people, where the current coronavirus is infecting somewhere between 2 to 3. So it is obviously a concern, and that's why there's a lot of effort internationally to try and contain this outbreak, but we have seen other diseases which are more problematic.
And are we at the start of the cycle here, or in the middle of it, or is it going to get worse?
So it's really hard to answer that question, principally because China has ended up experiencing the bulk of cases at the moment. Around 99% of the world's cases are currently in China. And obviously they've been implementing a number of very stringent measures, including quarantining millions of people. So we won't know for at least around a fortnight how effective those measures have been. Obviously there is a backlog, or it takes time to confirm cases. And so we will only see the effectiveness of those measures really in about a week or 2 weeks' time. At that point, we could be very well, right now, in hindsight, we could be at the peak of the outbreak, or this could just be the start. It really is, it's a wait-and-see game.
No doubt we'll talk to you again. Adam Kamrad-Scott, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, fears over the virus have triggered a sharp plunge in Chinese shares. Network Finance Editor Gemma Acton has more on this. Gemma, good evening to you. How have global markets reacted to this crisis?
Oh, Michael, not well. Let's start with China. The share markets opened today for the first time in about 10 days after the Lunar New Year holiday, dropped by around 8% immediately upon opening and didn't recover any ground throughout the day. This follows a big sell-off in the US share markets last Friday, and then today here in Australia we had our second worst trading day of the year so far. Now, one of the obvious victims when it comes to this is obviously oil demand and the oil price, with global travel and many businesses shuttered. We've seen energy companies really hit by that. Now, at the other end of the scale, often we see in a crisis a big rush towards safe havens such as gold, and we saw the gold price in recent days hit a new record high in Aussie dollar terms. Now, some of these market moves are driven by fear and uncertainty, but there's also a really rational response to the fact that economic growth is going to be hit, company profits are going to be hit, and that's going to be reflected in valuations.
So the travel ban that we have from China, what's the impact of that?
Well, Chinese visitors really form the backbone of our international tourism industry. We have about 1.4 million visitors a year. They have a very high spend, almost around $9,000 a person. So it's not just our hotels and our tour operators, it's also our retailers that are going to be affected by this. One of the broader fears is that this rolls out beyond visitors from China, and people around the world more generally who are planning to visit Australia think, you know what, I'm going to stay home until this virus is under control. And when you speak to economists, you know, they all agree with the government that there is definitely a hit to economic growth coming for Australia in the first quarter, if not the second quarter as well. But it's absolutely impossible to quantify at this stage, not least because we just have no idea when a cure will be found.
Look, I'm just thinking of the flow-on of all of those cancellations. People arrive at the airport, they catch a bus, they catch a taxi, they go for a harbour cruise, a bus tour into vineyards, and all those flow-on effects of cancellations
there are lots
along the way.
Of touch points for visitors here.
Yeah, we'll analyse that in a couple of weeks, I'm sure. So the market's reactions, how do they compare to previous global outbreaks like SARS?
Yeah, well, it's really tempting to try and draw parallels, but it's very difficult. You know, as we just heard our security experts say, the viruses themselves are very different. We have no idea how long this will go on for and how much economic damage will be wrought until it is cured. And, you know, secondly, markets are now in a very different place to when SARS broke out in 2003. New record highs last month for US and Australian markets. So many people are expecting some sort of correction in the near future anyway, which is another problem. So it's very difficult to tell yet, you know, exactly what the impact's going to be. And people are sure there's going to be an impact, but we can't quantify it yet. We'll talk about this later in the year.
Fingers crossed it's not as bad as we hope, but anyway. All right, Gemma, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been labelled a wildlife massacre, and it has nothing to do with bushfires. At least 40 koalas have been killed and more than 80 injured at the hands of bulldozers on a plantation in Portland, Victoria. The government's currently investigating the site after local resident Helen Oakley raised the alarm, posting this emotional video to Facebook.
I just can't do this. They've bulldozed 140 acres down and just killed all of their koalas. I'm tired and we've got no help, and the government should have stepped in and fixed this, but nobody has done anything. Look at the destruction that they've done, and there's koalas lying there dead, mothers killed and only little babies. Australia should be ashamed of this. I'm sorry, but I'm tired and we need help.
And Helen Oakley joins me now. Helen, thank you so much for joining the latest. Obviously visibly distressed in that video that you posted to Facebook. What was meant to happen here? Try and give us some context, or to the best of your understanding. I mean, surely these koalas were meant to be protected in that area.
Well, I believe so. From what I can understand, what has been said, the plantation companies did do the right thing, and they did do the koala count. And when I rang the owner, he told me that there was, I think, around about 72 or something like that in a count. And, you know, other than that, they did leave the appropriate number of trees for the appropriate number of koalas. But I think once they actually left the property and it handed over to him, it then became his property. He wanted to return it to pasture, and I guess that's when the bulldozing kind of happened.
Well, no doubt that'll be investigated, given that you've highlighted what's gone on here. We understand the man accused of clearing the former blue gum plantation claims that it, quote, has been blown out of proportion, and that most of the koalas found dead on the land died of starvation. What do you make of that response?
I don't think it's starvation. Personally, I just think they couldn't get away.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't actually physically check every tree before you hit on a bulldozer, and those koalas would have been petrified and just in shock.
Well, Helen, you've certainly raised attention to what has gone on here. What do you think needs to happen next?
Some plan, I guess, put in place so that this atrocity doesn't happen again. We seem to plant all these plantations. It becomes colonised by all the local habitat, koalas, bird life, koalas, wallabies, everything, and then they get established, and then we come in and we bulldoze them down. So it's a catch-22 situation. It's up to the government to come up with some really good plan to save our wildlife instead of destroying it.
Well, let's hope there's a plan, and let's hope there's more answers about exactly what went on there too. Helen Oakley, good to talk to you, and thank you for joining The Latest.
Thank you for that.
Well, Margot Robbie has stolen the show at the British Academy of Film and TV Awards in London. The actress didn't win in her category, but accepted Once Upon a Time in Hollywood co-star Brad Pitt's Supporting Actor Award on his behalf. Some very timely jokes at the expense of Brexit and Megxit.
So to pick up the award... OK, he starts by saying, "Hey, Britain, heard you just became single. Welcome to the club. Wishing you the best with the divorce settlement." Oh, and he says that he is going to name this Harry because he is really excited about bringing it back to the States with him. His words, not mine.
Well, as you can see there, William and Kate were sitting in the front row. There's their reaction, having a bit of a chuckle at that dig at Harry and Meghan. Still to come, why clapping is thought to help seal the deal for these marine mammals. And is this the most expensive nap in history? That's next, here on The Latest from 7 News. Back in a minute. Welcome back. We're looking over a very frosty Peter off in St. Petersburg, Russia. It's currently -1 there at the UNESCO World Heritage Site. Quite majestic, isn't it? Let's have a look at the temps around our country. Cloudy and 24 for Sydney, 25 and sunny in Canberra. Hobart, 21 and partly cloudy. In some other parts of the country, Townsville 34 and sunny, 22 with a few showers expected in Coffs Harbour. Possible storm in Broome, tops of 36 there. Well, isn't that unique? It took marine biologist Ben Burville 17 years to capture these remarkable images released today of grey seals clapping during breeding season. It's believed the seals use the noise to ward off competitors and attract potential mates. Apparently never been captured in the wild before. Well, while most people would enjoy an afternoon snooze on a Sunday, this man may have just had one of the most expensive naps in history. With an average ticket price of $9,000, the football fan didn't even make it to quarter time in the Super Bowl before nodding off. His now viral kip was shared by reporter Carissa Maxwell, who spotted him sleeping in the stands. Hopefully, he was a Kansas City Chiefs fan. Their win, certainly the stuff of dreams today. But tonight, this sleepy sensation during the Super Bowl is our final frame. Thank you for your company this evening. Sunrise is going to be back first thing tomorrow morning from 5:30, and you can also catch the latest on Facebook Watch every weekday afternoon. For now, though, from the team here at 7 News, that is The Latest. I'm Michael Usher. Have a good night.